Microphone's working? Yeah, perfect. Okay, without any further ado, I would now like to ask the chairperson to open the Grand Final Debate 2016. Enjoy.
We are incredibly happy to be debating the motion here today. This House believes that states should be allowed to pay other states to relocate and settle refugees. Can we please welcome in Team England with first speaker Rosa, second speaker Archie, third speaker Kenza. And Canada on opposition with first speaker Dasha, second speaker Rory, third speaker Alex. Can we please welcome and finally the adjudicators. Firstly, Paida Moyo Mangondo from South Africa. From Australia, Nicholas Cross from New Zealand, Kiana Rader from Malaysia, Rocio Azril from Argentina, who's chairing this. Branislav Feko from Slovakia. Lisa Schallenberg from Netherlands. Nilesh Ahmed from Pakistan. And Tekwei Tani from Singapore.
Without any further ado, I'd now like to welcome the first speaker of the proposition, Rosa, to open the debate.
In 1992, following the escalation of the Somalian civil war, refugees flowed into Kenya, and 2 out of 3 of the world's largest refugee camps were set up. And with little to no intervention from the Kenyan government, these camps became rife with sexual violence, radicalization, and poverty. And 25 years later, these camps remain. Kenya agitates to send these people back across the border, and more than 500,000 refugees languish without hope. In our world on side proposition, the UN, seeing the deterioration of the situation in Somalia, would have set up a UN session, with the global north offering cash, whilst the global south tender for these refugees. Nations like Uganda, nations like Cameroon, nations like Tunisia, nations like Burundi. In our world, those 500,000 people could have been saved. What are we going to prove to today in our position? It's very simple. Our model is going to prove that we can resettle more refugees faster and with a better quality of life. But firstly, what do we stand for on proposition? It's worth noting that there are a variety of examples already of states transferring money in return for other nations taking refugees. Most recently, the EU paid Jordan $700 million to keep its borders open to refugees and to cover costs. Furthermore, the World Bank then provided an extra $1.9 billion loan as a profit incentive for Jordan. With that in mind, what is our policy? 4 things. Firstly, what we support is a policy such as the Managed Global Settlement Mechanism, which will be passed by the UN Security Council on the 19th of September of this year. What is this? This is a systematization of existing exchanges that already occur. What does this mean? A, such exchanges become a global norm. B, these exchanges will no longer be purely compensation but also profit, as in the Jordan example. And C, we can have preemptive exchanges as opposed to purely reactive exchanges that we see under status quo. Secondly, exchanges will be brokered by the IOM social and legal rights, amongst other things. These people would not be living in either camps or political limbo for a protracted period of time. Fourthly and finally, what is our payment plan? 25% of the fee will be given in advance to host nations to cover the immediate costs when those refugees arrive on their doorstep. 50% of the fee will be paid following the crisis to cover long-term things such as services that you might need to provide for those refugees. Finally, 25% of the fee will be paid 3 years after the crisis, purely for profit, providing that the conventions for refugees were protractedly supported by the nations that were housing those refugees. So given that model, why is this our only way to fulfill our principled obligation? Look, the world has failed in its obligation to refugees by blindly following a mantra of fairness and ignoring the reality of states. Because some states have financial capability, but no political capacity to deal with refugees. On the other hand, other states have political capacity, but no financial capability to house refugees. Every single one of these states has an obligation to refugees, some of the world's poorest and most vulnerable people. But on T proposition, we acknowledge whilst there is a common principle, there must be different mechanisms for fulfilling that principle. No, thank you. In acknowledgement that all states are different, and we see this with many obligations. For example, peacekeepers. Some nations provide money, some troops, some logistics. States choose to fulfill their obligations in a huge variety of ways in the world in which we live, and by acknowledging this difference, we can maximise efficiency and our ability to save refugees by correcting a market failure and fulfilling our principal obligation in the best possible way to protect these refugees. Before I come on to my second point.
In the status quo, 80% of the individuals living in the 27 most developed nations want to take refugees. You remove that incentive, the point at which they are able to pay to never have to see the face of one.
Okay, that's clearly not true, because there are hundreds of nations in the developed world who do not want to take refugees. Why do we know this? Because when the EU finally forced people into a quota, the quota was set so low that it was a drop in the ocean compared to the 50 million refugees in the world. The reality is that the developed nations they want to talk about already have very little incentive to let refugees into their nation. As I'm going to come on to, under our side of the house, we can much more significantly improve their lives through our mechanism. So let's look at why we increase the number of refugees settled. Firstly, why are some states likely to pay? 3 types of states we think are likely to pay to resettle these refugees. Firstly, enthusiasts. Nations like Germany, Sweden, and Canada. These countries already have a huge willingness to help refugees that we've seen in the last few years. They are hugely likely to pay to resettle them in other nations if they think it would be beneficial for those refugees. Secondly, skeptics like the US, France, and the UK. Let's be clear, these nations are willing to pay in an abstract sense. The UK, our own country, pays 0.7% of GDP in foreign aid. It is the largest contributor per capita to the Syrian refugee crisis. But we are not willing to take refugees because despite our desire to help, an entire referenda in our country was lost due to fear of immigrants, due to fear of refugees, because there is an emotional, visceral reaction to the idea of having people in your country that is not tied to financial aid. There are social and cultural concerns that are not tied to giving financial aid. No, thank you. The rhetoric of the right plays on this, because Farage in the UK, Le Pen in France do not argue that these refugees deserve to die. They argue that they are inappropriate for those nations. They argue that they could be helped better through different mechanisms that do not clarify having them in those nations. By endorsing such a system on our side of the house, we allow nations to actively fulfill obligations, but without any of the barriers, no thank you, that accrue when you force people into taking refugees in the physical sense. We allow skeptical nations that otherwise help almost not at all in the status quo to help under our side of the house. Finally, scaremongering nations. We think that often there are nations that are obliged by other institutions to take refugees, but they always choose to pay as opposed to taking refugees. We point you to Hungary, that is obliged by the EU to take refugees, but they instead say that they would rather pay £250,000 per head to avoid taking a single refugee. Under our side of the house, this money is put to good use to resettle those refugees, as opposed to wasted in the bureaucracy of the EU. No, thank you. But secondly, why states are likely to take refugees, the kind of states that are going to be the hosts. Firstly, states bordering conflicts, and secondly, regional players in the global south. We think they're clearly going to take them, given that these nations will usually be incentivized by profit, given the fact that often they are some of the poorest nations in our world. So given that, here's why we resettle more refugees, because firstly, we increase capacity. Look, when you talk about capacity in terms of nations, it's not about physical space. It's about the capacity of housing, the capacity of services. When you give nations money, you literally create more capacity for those refugees. Furthermore, instead of in quota systems where you have an incentive only to meet the bare minimum, when every single time you take a refugee, you accrue profit, you have an incentive to take as many refugees as is feasible for your nation. Furthermore, we have an efficient use of resources. It is more expensive to house refugees in Canada than it is to house refugees in Jordan. Justin Trudeau tells us in his government that $1 billion is needed to house 25,000 refugees in his nation. We would rather house 10 times that number of refugees in nations closer to their own homes. Nations that, as my partner explained, these people would rather be in the first place. Under our side of the house, we are able to incentivize nations who otherwise do nothing to help. Under our side of the house, we are able to have a concrete solution to one of the biggest crises in our history. Under our side, we protect the 500,000. Vote proposition.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 19 seconds.
I thank Rosa for her speech. Now call upon the first speaker of the opposition, Dasha, to represent his case.
relocate refugees. So we regret the EU's deal, for example, with Turkey to take in refugees from Greece and Italy. Second, we support existing efforts by the UNHCR to monitor and improve conditions in refugee camps. And thirdly, we support the existing norm towards accepting refugees without payment. 3 arguments in this speech. Firstly, why this is morally unacceptable. Secondly, why this commodifies refugees. And thirdly, how it hurts the recipient countries. Before that's the refutation. In terms of the model, they say that we're going to enforce human rights standards by the UN. 1, they tell that this is an urgent, time-sensitive issue that people are suffering now, but they're also willing to wait while the UN regulates and monitors the condition of human rights abuses within these countries. But second of all, I don't think we can model out that there won't be human rights abuses within these nations. The point to which we're talking about a huge population influx on the most vulnerable nation states, which means they can't guarantee everybody a job. They can't guarantee everybody access to social services. The second claim is that countries are willing to give more money rather than accept these people into their own countries, and that money is incredibly useful to alleviating the problem. First, we contest that you're actually going to have a larger pool of donations. Rory brings this up in a while, we'll talk about it in my constructive, but it's far, far easier now for countries to not take in refugees and to just say we're going to ship money off overseas. Crucially, these are the countries that have the greatest capacity because they're the most developed to actually take in these individuals. But secondly, they assume that this is a long-term solution. What we would say is you destabilize developing world countries right now, and this impact is so important, panel. The reason for that is this is just one impact, but the point at which it's just one crisis, but the point at which you destabilize the entire region is the point at which it becomes harder for the entire region to lift up millions of people from poverty, a far greater magnitude of impact. The next claim is that you get less resentment and xenophobia towards refugees is a good thing. We would tell you that the trend is getting better already and that developed countries are pledging to take in more refugees. Even if there is xenophobia, which exists under both sides of the House, at least developed nations have legal protection to safeguard against that xenophobia. Moving on to my constructive, I want to talk about why this is morally unacceptable. When you pass this motion, we envision that the wealthiest nations are going to pay the countries with an economic incentive to accept refugees. In other words, the transfer is going to occur between developed countries and developing nations. The first part of this argument is that developed nations have a special obligation to accept refugees on the basis of responsibility and capacity. First, developed
nations uniquely caused many of the events that triggered forcible migration. So for instance, when the French propped up the Shias in Syria, they fomented ethnic conflict that peaked a bloody civil war. But secondly, in terms of capacity, developed countries have more money, space, infrastructure than a lot of the countries that they're actually going to be sending these refugees to. Crucially, why is this obligation specific to accepting refugees into your country and not just paying them to be taken elsewhere? Proposition is reducing refugees to a commodity and is coercing countries that developed nations have historically oppressed into taking on a burden that no country would reasonably actually be able to deliver on. This burden is massive because we're talking about an immediate, concentrated mass influx of refugees, which creates a devastating population shock. Our obligation is to ensure that refugees recover the capacities and the rights that they lost because of the circumstances necessitating their departure. Money is a part of this, but it can't recover things like the loss of a sense of agency, the loss of security, the loss of a sense of belonging. So when developed nations pay other countries to take in refugees, they can't ensure that refugees will be guaranteed a basic quality of life and that they'll regain these things that they once lost. The point at which you abdicate your responsibility to see the refugee through reintegration is the point at which you fail in your moral obligation. Why does this point matter, and why can proposition simply not instrumentalize it and tell you it's grounded in the consequences for settling a larger number of people? The world system was set up in such a way as to benefit the core countries at the expense of the developing world. Not only was the developing world coerced into existing in this system and into playing by its inherently unjust rules, they're now given a disproportionate burden which will stifle their development. This monetary incentive creates a veil that developed nations can hide behind and sets a harmful precedent that the West can throw money at the problems without actually addressing the actual conflict. This debate goes far further than our responsibilities to refugees. It affects the asymmetry of power between the developed and the developing world that is far larger. Next, I'm going to talk about how this motion commodifies and exploits refugees. This motion introduces a profit motive for taking in refugees. This normative shift has two outcomes. Firstly, countries who voluntarily pledge in the status quo to take refugees will no longer accept them for free. We have empirical analysis for this, so when governments, for instance, pay people for blood donations, the amount of donations that are voluntary decrease substantially, because people now see this transaction as being one that is monetary rather than altruistic. But the analysis behind this is that domestic populations will pressure their governments to receive payment in exchange for resettlement, because otherwise, what is the political will to spend tax dollars without any profit? But second of all, many of the wealthiest countries, I'll take you in a second, currently taking in refugees would no longer be willing to accept these pledged refugees, the point at which there is a country that is willing to accept them for a lower price. Ultimately, this proves that it probably isn't true that there's actually an increase in the pool of countries taking refugees. Sure.
If your stance is the norm of accepting refugees, can you explain where the 1 million refugees on the EU borders are to go under your side?
So, firstly, we support the UN, channeling money into existing camps and making those camps better, which is where a lot of them are going. But two, we think that a lot of developed countries have voluntarily pledged to take them in. This is the fact right now, and we think we should continue to support those countries. Why is this commodification harmful for refugees? This motion robs them of any conception of self-worth, the point at which they now have to internalize the feeling that they're only being accepted into a country because of profit reasons. This just exacerbates the feeling that they already have of being lost and dislocated. But looking at the practical impacts, recognize that many of the recipient countries affected by this motion would never have taken in refugees without it. So the sole factor changing their calculus is that they're now being offered money. Perhaps best case scenarios, countries generally want to take in a responsible number of refugees, but governments can still miscalculate their capacity to provide employment, social services, and shelter. But in the worst case scenario, these refugees are actually exploited because governments want this money to prop up the political support within their country for themselves. So what they're likely to do is intentionally accept more refugees than they have the capacity to take in order to get more money from the deal. The impact of this is that refugees are trapped in terrible living conditions. But crucially, it's irreversible and cemented indefinitely because once you are resettled, you cannot claim or ask to be resettled again. You have been given a new home country and you can't be like, I don't like this oppressive new state of affairs. Lastly, in terms of why this is bad for recipient countries, you significantly weaken the social services of these countries because developing countries are going to experience huge instant population shocks that are going to strain the existing infrastructure that they have. This is the case with existent camps. But the impacts of this are unique to proposition because we're talking about concentrated, rapid resettlements into the countries that have the least capacity to provide for these refugees. They don't fix the problem, they
speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 16 seconds.
I thank Dasha for her speech and call upon the second speaker of the proposition, Archie, to continue the debate.
Can everyone hear me? Cool. So we found it a little bit confusing on Team England when Canada stood up and started supporting this huge new revolutionary change to the status quo they claimed. But then, when the actual model they suggested essentially was only the status quo minus what we were doing, i.e. the only thing in the status quo that was actually working. So we pushed them, we asked them to hear why, what exactly changed. And we hear the UN channels money to countries which currently have refugee camps. Ladies and gentlemen, that's our model. In the very first speech of Team Canada's case, they've already conceded our case. They've already said, you know what we should do? We should have the global north, play the global south, we're already holding refugees, in order to help them support them, improve their conditions in the camp, and support their situation. That's a huge concession right out of the bat from Team Canada. In my speech today, we talked about the quality of life these refugees have, why it's substantially improved when they're housed close to the regions where they come from, particularly in the global south. For that, I have quite a lot more detailed rebuttal. So, let's look at the rebuttal first. So firstly, this idea that refugees being in the global south is a very, very bad thing. My substantive engage with that, but a few responses right before that. No thanks. So we heard, first of all, you cannot monitor human rights situations in the developing world. Look, we accept our policy isn't going to be perfect. We also know, however, we think we can do a very good job of this. Why is this true? Firstly, the UN has a lot of experience in monitoring human rights situations. Secondly, though, and much, much more importantly, countries are going to want to be able to take refugees in the long term. We put in our model there is a substantial profit incentive for them to do this. If it comes out that they're treating refugees very badly, it's very unlikely they're then going to be able to get future deals in order to take refugees later down the line. There's absolutely no incentive for them to do this on their side of the house if they want that process to continue. We then note, and we heard absolutely no response to this vital part of Rosa's case from Team Canada, the thing about purchasing power. The fact that Justin Trudeau very recently went to Canada's Parliament and asked for $1 billion Canadian dollars, no thank you, in order to settle 25,000 refugees in Canada. It costs $40,000 Canadian dollars therefore to settle one refugee in Canada. It costs $3,500 in contrast to settle a refugee in Jordan or Lebanon. We suggest Canada uses that money to settle 10 times the refugees. That sounds like a far better way of supporting the world. We then heard, no thank you, the Global South doesn't have enough money, ladies and gentlemen, that's why we're giving them some. And then finally we heard, oh no, but xenophobia actually doesn't exist in developed nations. Ladies and gentlemen, look around. Look at the far right in Europe. Look at Donald Trump. Look what's happening throughout our world. To say that xenophobia doesn't exist in the Western world is ludicrous. In fact, I'll explain why it's worse there than it is in the Global South. No thanks. We then heard about special obligations. The fact that the developed world has a special obligation to refugees. And to an extent, I think we can concede this and still basically take this point. Because Rosa told you very clearly that we know that, no thank you, all have obligations to refugees. It's just a question of how we dispense them. Whether we dispense them by giving away land, whether we dispense them by giving away houses, whether we dispense them by giving away money so we can get land and houses in other places. Those are all equally legitimate ways to dispense our obligations, just like peacekeeping. They never seem to want to pay attention to that. We heard, no thank you, there is an asymmetry of power in the world. This is very, very bad. Let's be very clear. This is a policy of choice. If a country in the developed world does not want to take money to take refugees, they have absolutely no compulsion to do so. So, thirdly then, we heard that we would commodify refugees. This was very, very bad. To start off with, we heard some touchy-feely analysis about how if you're commodified, you feel lost. You go to a place for agency or location in the world. You know when you feel lost? When you're stuck in a refugee camp with no future, ladies and gentlemen. When you don't know what country you're going to be living in 5 years' time. You know when you feel lost, ladies and gentlemen, when your children are dying of cholera because the situation at refugee camp is so terrible. No, thank you. Rosa told you very clearly. We can move people out of refugee camps into stable accommodation with running water, with locks on the doors. We can only do that when we fund countries like Jordan and Lebanon and Tanzania to do all of those things. They can't do that because they can't pay them to do that. We then heard they'd be exploited. Again, we were very clear this wasn't true. We already dealt with that. So finally we heard actually, when you pay someone to do something, they don't do it as much. Which is some of the most hilarious analysis I've ever heard in the 5 other world schools. To
Point.
Rosa told you very clearly what the incentives these countries have. I'll go over them again. First, these countries are overwhelmingly very, very poor. A profit increase their budget can make a concrete difference in how much the government can provide for their citizens. That's huge. Lots of governments, we tell you, will probably take that. Secondly, though, no thank you. These countries often need cash right now towards vital infrastructure. They're often at the stage of they're building roads and bridges and so on, upgrading them for the first time. This is precisely the most important time in these countries to get that injection of cash. It's a really great reason why they're going to do that. Moving on then, let's chat a bit about quality and about standard material. Before that, I'll grab a quote from Canada.
If your position is that you simply want to pay to make these camps better, can you please explain the part of your case that's about relocating or resettling?
Okay, let's be clear. We supported a two-pronged case on our side of the house. In situations where refugees are already in countries, we support paying those countries to keep the borders open, improve the situations in those camps, and generally do things to make sure these refugees have a suitable situation there. Note the word in the motion was settled, by the way. Moving on, though, more generally, no thank you, we tell you the other half of our case is in situations where refugees are somewhere where the country does not want to have them, we can then move them. This is a two-pronged policy. We support doing this both in the present and in the future. That was very, very clear right from the bat, right in Rosa's speech. Alright, so moving on then, let's talk about quality. Because as well as getting people out of camps faster and doing so in greater numbers, we actually get to give them a better long-term solution too. A number of ways we do this. To start off with, we can improve the quality of settlements. Note, again, this kind of directly clashes with all the stuff we've been talking about in the Pier 1, but you need a lot of money to transition all of these tent cities into accommodation with running water, with logs, and all of those things. Right now, the UNHCR doesn't allow NGOs to operate in these places at night, ladies and gentlemen, because the risks of assault and violence are so high. We think we can do a lot just with that money to move that forward. But more directly engaging their case then, let's talk about moving to more appropriate locations, because actually, generally areas which are closer to the initial conflict are the best places to house these refugees. States like Tanzania, states like Colombia, states like Malaysia are all really great places. Let's look at one. To start off with language and culture. In East Africa, Swahili is a lingua franca. Throughout the Arabic world, although people speak different dialects, almost everyone watches Egyptian TV, almost everyone speaks modern standard Arabic. If you want to get people in education, if you want to get people in jobs, the best way to do that, ladies and gentlemen, is to ensure they have that basic linguistic and cultural common ground with the people they're living around. Not places like Canada or the UK, where they don't speak English, they're a different religion, and the culture is completely different. Moreover, we tell you the labour economies often mirror these countries far, far more. I'm told Canada has a lot of snow. If you're from West Africa, you spend most of your life farming yams and farming maize, I imagine it would be very difficult to integrate yourself into the labour economy of Canada very easily, given it's largely a surface economy. Beyond just that, the diasporas in these regions are necessarily going to be bigger because they're closer to these main areas. That makes integration a lot easier when you already have a base of people who speak your language, who are part of your culture, who can help you go out and find a job and get integrated into society in the first place. And finally, in terms of racism, directly engaging on what they said, you simply stand out a lot less in places where you're not literally of a different race to the people surrounding you the same way you are if you're going literally to Europe. Ultimately, state racism is probably going to be less, but more importantly, potentially, individual racism is going to be less. We simply refuse to believe that on the streets of Hungary, you stand out less than you do on the streets of Tanzania if you're a refugee from Somalia or Kenya. But lastly, we tell you actually economies of scale work too. The comparative advantage when these states, in the long term, would do this with lots and lots of separate refugee crises going into the future. We tell you these states can actually become very good at this and make this a real source of revenue. Let's be very clear. This is the only policy right now that is currently working to help refugees. We're advancing it, systematizing it, and making it better. We're very happy to propose this motion.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 3 seconds.
I thank Archie for his speech and call upon the second speaker of the opposition, Rory, to continue his case.
We hear from Team England a couple of funny things. The first is that they think that the profit motive that they create is the main incentive for these states to take in these refugees. Except that profit is only actually seen 3 years after they agree to take in these initial refugees. So if it's the profit that makes these countries want to take in these refugees, I don't when she tells you that the incentives of these particular states isn't always to keep these refugee centers great. When the Kenyan refugee camps that they talk about shut down in order to make the incentive of the people bargaining with them to give them more money more quickly, I think that you actually make the incentives of those who want to help refugees much more perverse. Two things in this speech. First, refutation of everything we've heard down the prop bench. Secondly, a constructive argument about why we think we harm our long-term ability to deal with refugee crises, and why that's so much more important than any of the immediate harms we face right now. So let's look at what we heard.
On that,
The first thing that we heard, no thanks, not now, is that we have this idea of some sort of obligation, that states have the ability, and furthermore, the obligation to deal with these refugees. Firstly, I want to point out that the principle is only a principle so much as it's hung on them proving their practical benefits, that these states are making these lives of these refugees better. I think that they actually get less resettling, the point at which they cut out the vast majority of countries from actually taking refugees in, the point at which they pacify their obligation by paying for another country to take those refugees. But secondly, I think that they're actually misconstruing the world that we live in, because while countries don't take in all of the refugees that are on the borders of the European Union, it's increasing. And I think that you actually decrease that norm of countries being willing to take refugees, the point to which you allow the most capable countries to pay away that burden. And secondly, I think that they actually fail to deal with largely the principled analysis that Dasha told you about. She told you that this debate is larger than our obligation to refugees. It's also about the obligation of large developed states that have profited off of a system that is fundamentally unequal. They never contested that these are going to be huge population shocks. In fact, their case only works to the point at which they are huge population shocks. Therefore, they need to defend increasing the difficulty to develop that developing nations currently face. But secondly, they told you there are a couple of groups of countries that are likely to pay. I agree much more refugees. Why is that? Firstly, there is a disconnect between the extent of policy action and popular support. As I stated in a POI, 80% of the people living within these nations do want to take refugees. Sure.
How do you incentivize Jordan to open its borders to stop people in Syria from dying without paying Jordan to take them and open those borders?
Oh, first, I forgot to say this earlier. The first prong of their plan is actually something that we can do as well, to the extent that we don't move these refugees. We simply improve the countries that they already go to. So we can pay Jordan, and we can give them aid to make those camps better. They need to prove why it's about resettling aid. The Human Rights Council on Refugees already has a budget that I think that they can use for this particular purpose. But let's get back into my argument. Because I think the problem in the status quo is that a certain vocal minority is able to dissuade politicians from taking in those refugees. So let me give you a bunch of reasons why that vocal minority is likely to become much less powerful in the immediate future. First, leaders are able to stand up to them all the time. Look to Merkel in Germany. Secondly, often leaders don't need them for electoral success, such that they are simply a minority. Thirdly, their views diminish over time, especially when refugees actually improve the situation of a country. So when they've raised the GDP of Lebanon by 1.3%. Fourth, though, I think once one stream is accepted, it's easier to facilitate further acceptance economically, weakening the main stance that exists against taking refugees. We think that this norm is undermined by their model, the point to which it reinforces attitudes that refugees are such a burden on your system that in order for anyone to ever want to accept them altruistically, they need to make up for the cost of having those people there. That means that people aren't incentivized to provide for their needs politically, like hospitals, like schools, but also there are vast social implications. We furthermore think that there's funding volatility on their side, the point to which it's easier to stop making payments to a country than it is to literally force people that you've already accepted out of the borders of your nation. But secondly, bargaining incentives, as I mentioned earlier, where states, in order to get the most favorable agreements, are likely to make the situations seem much more dire. Because I think that we create a situation that is much more beneficial for refugees in the long term, but also in the short term, since that's all they want to talk about. I'm proud to oppose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 13 seconds.
I thank Rory for his speech, and I'll call on the third speaker of the proposition, Kenza.
We couldn't believe it when they said it in the first speech, but ladies and gentlemen, they said it once again in Rory's speech, and I quote, "We can pay and give Jordan aid in order to improve the camps on the ground." Why is this so problematic for side opposition to support in this debate? It's because, firstly, it undermines the analysis they give you about incentives not to let refugees into your own country. If presumably they support a situation in which states are able to fund the improvement of camps without allowing refugees into their country in the first instance. But secondly, and even more perversely, here's the current divide between the two teams in this debate. Side opposition stands for a situation in which you see horrific camps in the likes of Lebanon and Turkey, and then give them money, presumably, to improve these camps by relocating and settling refugees, i.e. paying these nations to relocate and settle refugees. Whereas on side opposition, we support a system of preemptively acting in order to create actual living standards for refugees that we see in conflicts around the world. We are the side that actually acts, and side opposition one that only wishes to react. 3 points of clash in this debate. Firstly, is this principally legitimate? Secondly, I'm going to look at the number of refugees and the speed with which they are accepted. And thirdly, let's look to quality of life. So the first of which, in terms of whether or not this is principally legitimate, the first claim of side opposition in this debate is you cannot treat these individuals as commodities because they need crucial agency. Archie responds to this in his speech when he says, the real point at which you don't don't have any agency is when you are trapped in a refugee camp on the border, one of the 1 million Syrians who are currently on the EU borders across the world. Crucially, when we gave him that response, no retort in Rory's speech. But secondly, the underlying premise of the argument they give you is fundamentally that they value the idea that in the abstract terms, you are treated as a commodity over and above the likelihood of death and significant harm within these refugee camps. Think about it. If I was a refugee in this camp, the abstract term of, oh, I'm being treated as a commodity because they've given me housing and given me food, how outrageous of them. And crucially, it's just not the sort of logic that we think these individuals are likely to go through under your side. Their second claim, they say, you are reneging on your responsibility as a developed nation, given that you are often complicit or responsible for the creation of harms within these nations. And they point to asymmetry that occurs in the world. At no point does this point actually respond to the material that Rosa gives you in her speech about the plurality of the fulfillment of responsibilities. And she gives you the example of peacekeeping. Not every nation in the world offers troops. Some offer funds, some offer logistics. And there are different roles to play in the global problems that we see. All that we say outside proposition is that we should take a similar stance with an idea like the refugee crisis, whereby different nations can take different stances. But the second failure of this point is it doesn't recognize the fact that what we're actually dealing with in this debate is a form of market failure. Because there are some states who are, whilst willing in theory to take in refugees, are constricted by the political landscapes within their countries. Countries such as those of the UK, who, despite their fear of immigrants, are willing to spend 0.7% of their GDP on foreign aid. We are actually able to correct that asymmetry and recognize there are some nations that can do the housing and some nations that can do the funding. That is crucial because it actually improves the quality of life and the numbers of refugees that we're able to settle. But no, finally, what was most crucial on side opposition is that they recognized the problem, but didn't see concrete ways in which they could actually increase the acceptance of refugees. We told you that the problem exists now and today, and these people are dying in camps that side opposition allows them to languish in until the political landscapes change sufficiently as to let the most vulnerable people in the world into these nations. We told you on side opposition. We were not willing to wait for this day. We chose to act now. No, thank you. Let's look second. Let's look at the number of refugees and the speed with which they are accepted. No, crucially, in side opposition's case, they argued both that these individuals wouldn't have the ability to take them in, but simultaneously the nations wouldn't have any incentive to do so because they lack a profit mechanism in order to incentivize them to do so. A number of responses, on the first of which they don't have the ability to take these individuals in. That was literally the status quo within these nations. They do not receive adequate funds with which to actually deal with the mass numbers of refugees they see. Under our side, we create a system where the moral obligation manifests itself in a way that obliges you to actually fund these nations and fund their relocation. I'll take you in a second. But it, secondly, refuses to engage the idea of purchasing power parity. They claim that all we're doing is throwing money at the problem. That is crucial because you're actually able to house significantly more refugees in nations where the cost of living is significantly lower than you are the likes of the UK or that of Canada. That crucially increases the number of refugees that we're able to save under our side. Before I continue, yes.
Australia gave Cambodia $55 million for resettlement. 5 people were resettled. 2 decided to go back to their home countries to escape the terrible conditions. How do you ensure good quality of life for these people?
Wait, sorry, how many millions of dollars and they only settled 5? That sounds just outrageous as a statistic under their side. But crucially, we don't have to support terrible means of actually reallocating these funds in order to house refugees. We give you plethora of examples on our side, where, for instance, in 1995, $35 million was spent by the UNHCR on resettling thousands of Mozambican refugees in nations like Malawi. That is something that you're crucially unable to do under your side when they do not have the funds with which to actually engage in these mechanisms of resettlement. Their next step, they say, you will not do this, you are not getting the money in order to do so. This assumed a full status quo on the side opposition, because currently we're not seeing the acceptance of thousands of refugees, despite the fact that we have quotas which are supposed to compel European nations to do so. Instead, we see situations in both Hungary, the Czech Republic, Spain, all vocaling opposition against the impositions of quotas on the basis that they simply do not want these refugees to be within their nation. We create other means by which they can offset this responsibility. But finally here, the loss came in Rory's speech as well. They're unlikely to do so because they're unlikely to have this profit mechanism because they only get this money 3 years later. Crucially, that's how any profit mechanism works. I work for my job because I get paid at the end of the month, not because I get paid at the end of the hour. Crucially, these individuals can see into the future the fact that they were going to get this money and still have that profit mechanism existing. But finally here, this points to the fact that they're systematically unlikely to treat these refugees horrifically on the basis that in our model, that money was going to be taken away from you. That is when we get this decrease in radicalization, decrease in the proliferation of rape that is currently occurring within these refugee camps. Let's look thirdly and finally in terms of the quality of life. They claim that now we would have to move all of the refugees out of Germany. Quite obviously, that isn't really worth the fact for the German government, given that these people are already introduced. Our contention would be that you take the 1 million refugees who are currently in no man's land, trapped in the camps and trapped on the borders, and you pay for other states to relocate and settle them in regions that are closer to home. Because I gave you access to the diaspora, the fact that modern Arabic is spoken across these regions. And it's far easier for me to speak Arabic as a person from Jordan than it is for me to speak Arabic in a nation like Canada. Crucially, your access to jobs and your access to opportunities, crucially important to the quality of life, was made significantly better under our side. We increased the speed with which these people were accepted. We increased the number that were accepted. We stood proudly on the side of opposition.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 11 seconds.
I thank Kenza for his speech, and now call upon the third speaker of the opposition, Alex, to conclude the substantive portion of the debate.
In a debate about the responsibilities that the richest countries have to the poorest people in the poorest areas of the world, Team England was far too flippant in responding to our principle. Their only response to this was ever, well, there are other ways to deal with it that fulfill this principal obligation. They were never actually able to deal with the crux of this, which is why they've lost this debate thus far. I want to speak about 4 things in closing this debate for opposition. Firstly, their model issues and what actually plays out in the real world. Secondly, I want to look at how fair this policy is. Thirdly, the short-term impact on these countries that people go to. And lastly, the long-term implications for refugees and developing countries as a whole. Beginning with their model. Team England wanted too much of their model. The first claim we said is we can have it all because of UN oversight, we can have great conditions, and we can move a lot of people. The problem is resources, and you simply can't have both. Either they take more refugees at a rapid pace, which deals with the problem that they say. The problem is, as we've identified, is the infrastructure oftentimes doesn't exist in these areas already, meaning that it takes a long time to build it up. So to the extent that they want to take more people, they can't do it as nicely as they want to. To the extent that they want this to take a longer period of time, that just means the types of norms and not the status quo, but the increasing trend towards actually taking refugees on our side is more compelling for that. The second thing that they say then is that their 3-year profit thing is fine. And Kenza comes up and says, well, you get paid at the end of the month. Yeah, you get paid at the end of the month, not at the end of 3 years. The distinctions that they're paying is, if they think that people are so xenophobic that they don't want to, no thank you. If people are so xenophobic that they don't want to have to deal with refugees and deal with immigrants, why would they take your payment in 3 years? They probably want it now, and they won't want to live with refugees for 3 years. Given that they don't actually know the harms of these types of things, I don't see why they get that on our side of the house. What they more likely have to support then is a lump sum payment that actually deals with facilitating the move for these refugees and actually creating enough political will for this policy to be effective. The last thing they talked about was their general enforcement mechanism and why they can actually enforce the types of things that they want. The problem is you have no enforcement mechanism under their side of the house. Countries who are paying for this lose all leverage at the point where refugees are already in the developing country and they don't have resources. The The reason for this is the only leverage you could possibly have is taking away funding. But if you take away that funding, you make these refugees' lives infinitely worse. I don't see how they have any type of enforcement mechanism to solve this. The only thing they said in response to this then is, well, you want future deals, you want to take in more refugees in the future. So this is basically the assumption that this is their great cash grab and they're going to make a lot of money from this, right? So to the extent that they're going to make a lot of money, I don't see why other countries would reasonably be involved in doing this. But the second thing we'd say to that is that these deals oftentimes take a long time. It takes a lot of infrastructure to build. I don't see why we're striking multiple.
More information.
The last thing that they wanted to talk about is they say that we contradict our own case when we say we're fine with people donating to refugee camps. We're not contradicting our own case. We're fine with donations to refugee camps so long as the principal obligation to actually take refugees still exists. But secondly, what they need to support isn't just giving to refugee camps. They need to move people out of those camps and forcibly, effectively, put them in developing countries. That's something they never agreed with. So that deals with the model of what actually happens. Yes.
Which is preferable, leaving refugees in tent cities or waiting for the political will for the acceptance of refugees in Western states to change?
Okay, what I'd say to that is we're in favor, this is our stance here, that we were very clear about. We are in favor of improving those conditions within those refugee camps, and then having those people move to countries in developed worlds where they can have ultimately better lives, and in the short term, taking more people and trapping them into developing nations and overwhelming those developing nations to the extent that those people's lives are worse. That's our stance, we were very clear. Let's talk about fairness now for a moment. The first thing they make then is states have different capacities and you can just help in one way. So giving money is just like helping. They talk about agency, they talk about peacekeeping, for example. Giving money is categorically unlike taking refugees for two very specific reasons. And this is the comparative, because it's the countries who would have otherwise taken these refugees that are now paying to push them away. Two reasons why it's different. First, these aren't just poor people, so you can't just solve the issue with money. These are people whose rights have oftentimes been violated. These are people who need safety and security. The problem is, their side of the house, which places a ton of these people into very poor areas, doesn't give them the conditions that actually make their lives better, so you can't improve those people's lives. Secondly, however, is you're not morally responsible for actually improving those lives. Given that we've proved that they have an inability to follow through on their side of the house, you can't claim to be morally actually helping these people when you effectively just give money to another actor to deal with it. And I know that these guys sound really great with their English accents, and that it's difficult to conceptualize when you have it in states. But let's talk about individual people for a second. Their policy is if somebody comes to me and asks for help, I just pay somebody else and say, deal with their problem. That is principally not supporting them in the way that you have to. But secondly, and more importantly, what they never responded to is they can't just say and instrumentalize it in a way that says, we get better situations for refugees, so therefore we fulfill our principal duty. The distinction here is, it's not just a responsibility to refugees, but to developing nations as a whole, and that's something they didn't engage with. We talked about the inherent structures of power that oftentimes mean developing nations are systematically disadvantaged and coerced into taking these refugees. The problem is these guys entrench that system of power to the extent that developed nations can absolve themselves of their guilt and say, here, you can just take away the problem and we'll fund you in a very general way and not follow through on that. That is the principle that I never responded to. That was important to this debate. But if they wanted to only debate on practice, we're fine with debating with them as well. No thank you. Let's talk about their short-term impacts. The first thing they claim is we can take more refugees, and they conceded that it's the poorest nations that will be taking them. They say it's a money issue. When we give them more money, then they're better. This overlooks two key things. Money doesn't solve the problem. The problem when you have such a massive number of people is space. The problem when you have such a massive number of people is the political will and the anger that you have in these areas that simply giving people money 3 years later down the line doesn't actually account for. Money doesn't solve the problem. You need to move them into other areas. Secondly, however, this is worse for the poorest areas. These are the areas that are most likely to be coerced into taking the money for the short-term benefit. Look, we're not saying that these states are malicious, but we're saying that they're short-sighted and that they're unable to make good decisions. So states, like we gave you the analysis, are oftentimes they're overwilling to estimate the amount of political will they have and overwilling to decide how many resources they have, when in reality they don't have those resources. That's why that doesn't work.
For information.
Sure.
Do you think that a sufficient number of refugees have currently been accepted into Western states? And if not, how would you change that?
We think that at the moment there are large moves from countries that you guys identified, like Canada, like Germany, to do so. There's a trend towards this, given the increasing understanding that the global poor and the Syrian refugee crisis is an issue. We say that the wrong thing to do would be to lock them into the poorest areas of the world, and for these people to not see these issues, and therefore leave them hanging there. That's our response. The second thing they claim then is we can resettle more people, because $40,000 is a lot more than $3,500. So firstly, this numerical distinction actually comes from the fact that in terms of foreign exchange costs and dollar values is actually how that difference comes. But yeah, it's probably cheaper because the conditions that they live in are way worse. They get 8 times worse conditions under their side of the house. That's terrible. The second thing they wanted to talk about then was refugees facing racism in these worlds, in areas close to them. We already gave you very good reason to believe that if you're a Shia Muslim in that particular area, just being geographically close doesn't actually solve those types of problems. But what we said then is that it's better for you to live in developed countries where you have actual legal protections for the types of xenophobia that exist regardless. What was important then was the long-term impacts of this case that they were unwilling to engage with sufficiently. This is irreversible because we lock people into those conditions. We talked about destabilizing regions, and why when you lock the global poor and those who are refugees in the poorest areas, these countries can't develop. This debate is more than just about solving the Syrian refugee crisis. It's about having an equitable situation in the world in which developing countries can develop, and they don't get that under their side of the house to the extent that they want to shut these people out. We talked about how this completely stops the norms and trends towards taking refugees right now in the developed world that do exist, and we say are stronger. At the end of the day, so far as we can improve the situation for while refugees are in that waiting period, we say it's worse to move all of them into those areas we're proud to oppose.
Speakers go for 8 minutes and 8 seconds.
I thank Alex for his speech and call upon Rory to deal with the opposition's reply.
Proposition's policy pacifies the political will of the most integral nations to this fight at the expense of the lives of refugees both in the short and long term. In this speech, I'm going to use two themes to prove to you why on a comparative basis, team opposition has won. Looking firstly at moral obligation, and secondly at the impact on refugees. So let's look at moral obligation. We heard from team proposition that due to the capacity of developed nations, they have a moral obligation to help these individuals. But there are multiple ways to fulfill a moral obligation that you hold. Recognize this is hung on them proving that they fulfill that moral obligation. The extent to which they recognize the capacity of these nations is the willingness that they need to prove to you why the quality of life of these individuals living in the developing third world countries that they speak about is going to be the same quality of life as could be provided if we continued with the trend of these developed nations taking more refugees. But in opposition, we gave you a much more sophisticated principle. That principle is that our obligation isn't solely to the refugees. Our obligation is also to the developing nations that we have profited off of the backs of. Our obligation is also to the nations that exist in that developing state due to our actions. The point at which their policy works as well as they want it to is the point at which these countries get huge influxes, huge population shocks that Dasha told you from the start of the debate makes it incredibly difficult for them to develop. On a comparative basis, team opposition fulfills their obligation to far more individuals. But let's look at the impact on refugees, because this is where team proposition hangs their case. We think that when team proposition rests their case on both getting more refugees settled and more countries willing to settle refugees, they fail in their objectives. The reason being, Dasha tells you in the beginning of her speech that we think it's problematic the point at which you are cutting off developed nations from ever accepting refugees. They tell you that they don't accept enough, but I think you make the problem worse when now they won't accept it at all. The point at which millions of refugees have been taken in by the developed world is the point at which I think we should continue that trend. If you tell them that their obligation is more. The problem is, when we tell you that we need to just get these refugees settled in the most urgent of circumstances, they fail to recognize that often they are leaving these refugees to lives that are comparably worse to what they are dealing with right now. So when Dasha tells you that states have the incentives to take this money, but not necessarily make their life situations good, Team Proposition's only response is then we'll take away the money, making the lives of the refugees that have already been settled there exponentially worse. When governments have the incentives to make the situation of refugees so bad that states will give them more money, is the life in which refugees are given a worse quality of living. Because we stand both for fulfilling our moral obligation, but also for improving the lives of refugees on a comparative basis, I'm very proud to oppose.
The speakers spoke for 4 minutes and 11 seconds.
I thank Rory for her speech and call upon Archie to deliver the proposition.
Side opposition wanted to fight this debate on false comparative. They claimed that we should bring refugees the gleaming lights of Calvary instead of trapping them in developing nations. In reality, the choice is between a constant no-man land of tent cities and a chance of rebuilding your lives in nations close to your own with greater affinities with your own, in a world where developed nations have the gate locked and where the drawbridge is going up. There are 2 issues in this debate. Firstly, that of principle. Secondly, who helps refugees more? And to explain these one by one, why Team England won both of these. So firstly, in terms of principle. We told you very clearly that an obligation to help refugees existed, and it was an obligation that could be dispensed in many different ways. In the third speech, you started hearing that no, actually, if my friends are in lots of trouble, and I pay someone else to help them, that's really, really bad. Let's be very clear. The analogy here is if my friend is having a heart attack, and I see a paramedic, and I pay the paramedic to help him instead of helping him myself because I know the paramedic can do a better job. Ultimately, the important thing here is our metric actually helps refugees more. We then heard also that this is a policy of imperialism and colonialism because we're hurting developing nations. We were very clear throughout these speeches. Developing nations have a choice about whether or not to take these. We trust the developing world to decide whether or not this policy is in their interest. So on the issues of principle, this debate clearly fell to Team England, but importantly now, let's move on to the actual battle of this debate. Who helps refugees more? So both sides agree that we should pay Jordan to keep refugees who are there right now. In some sense, that's a concession for our case, but let's just take it as it is. Where the 2 sides disagree is where refugees aren't already there, where they're leaving Syria and Somalia and Central African Republic. We say we should move them to Lebanon, Tanzania, to Cameroon. They say they should try their hardest, but potentially fail, to move them to Canada, the UK, and Germany, which is better for refugees. Let's be very clear. Their side of the house means that fewer people are settled and more people are in limbo. Why is this true? Trying to force Western nations to take refugees has been a bit of a disaster. We told you why last week. We told you there's huge political opposition to the idea of people from other countries coming to your country in a way there wasn't the abstract principle of giving money away. That's why lots of countries have foreign aid budgets, but at the same time don't do very high migration. We heard large moves have been made to switch this trend. We told you that trend was actually decreasing. The rise in xenophobia in Europe speaks to that. The fact that Merkel's having to backtrack her commitments to German refugee acceptance speaks to that. Moreover, even if that trend is true, let's be very clear. What's been taken, what even the most optimistic predictions they're saying is going to be taken, is a drop in the ocean compared to the 15 million refugees who are currently stuck around the world trying to improve their lives. We tell you further, though, that purchasing power parity means that given both sides of this house have a finite amount of money we can spend on refugees, it's actually much better to allocate them to our side of the house. We heard the cost differences between sending someone to Canada and sending someone to Lebanon were very small. We tell you no, ladies and gentlemen, they are huge. We gave you numbers. We gave you analysis to back up those numbers. That it costs more, that language lessons and so on are also more expensive. Things are more expensive in Canada than they are in Lebanon. But beyond just that, we told you that people are actually happier when they're in places where they can integrate better, where the language and culture and religions were similar. Yes, of course, there's great diversity in the Middle East. We were saying on the comparative there's more diversity between areas of the Middle East and Canada. We told them they could integrate better into the labour economy. They said get them coats. That wasn't a good enough response, ladies and gentlemen. So we were much better than these people. And all the responses we got from them were essentially one line. So let's look at a few of them. We heard the human rights situation was bad, and our only mechanism is to remove the money. We agree we can remove the money. Crucially, we said in our model, we remove the last 25%, which is pure profit, so we don't hurt the refugees. They said xenophobia is on the rise. Ladies and gentlemen, xenophobia is on the rise even more in our countries. Brexit, we know that all too well. We heard that when you stabilise the region, we tell you these countries can choose what to do. We heard that 3 years meant no one would take these things. We tell you people can through 3 years ahead of the developing world, and even if they can't, just take out a loan. Ultimately, that's still because ultimately on an intuitive basis, what the other side gets more refugees out of camps into sustainable living, more into places where they actually want to live, where there are more affinities, they integrate better. Team England was incredibly proud to propose this today. Thank you very much.
And that concludes the end of the debate and the end of the finals for the World Schools Debating Championships 2016. Could both teams please cross over and shake hands?
Wow, thank you very much, England and Canada, for this debate. Little information on procedure. There's now going to be a 10-minute intermission during which water is going to be served in this room so you can have some refreshment. And the adjudicators may now follow